In 2019, my grandparents told us a story about renting a summer cottage near a lake. Shortly after moving into the summer cottage, they began to hear what sounded like bats flying around. On the very first night, and every night thereafter, they would experience the bedding on the bed flying off right at 3 a.m. Every night when that would happen, both my grandmother and my grandfather would search the summer cottage to see what happened, and they would find a fire in the fireplace. My grandparents decided it was time to talk with the owners of the summer cottage. When my grandparents reported the incidents to the cottage owners, they stated that no one else had reported any incidents in all the years that they'd been renting out the cottage. However, their tone did seem suspicious. But they did share that there had been an issue with bats around the lake. On the third morning, there was a knock at the door, and when my grandmother went to the door, there was an older lady asking for Alfred Smith. My grandmother said it was a rented cottage and no one by that name lived there. The older lady at the door said that she comes there all the time and this was the home of Alfred Smith. My grandmother said it was a summer cottage and it couldn't be the home of Alfred Smith. My grandmother suggested that she check neighboring houses to see if maybe she was just confused. On the fourth afternoon, my grandparents decided to take a walk. On the walk, they stumbled upon a cemetery just outside of the little town by the lake. While walking by the cemetery, my grandmother stopped and said to my grandfather, "Look at that tombstone. Look what it says." My grandfather read the tombstone, and it says Alfred Smith, 1880 to 1944. It was the exact same name as the woman stated lived in the summer cottage they were renting. My grandparents thought there must be some rational reason for everything that was happening. They thought maybe that Alfred Smith had a son and that's who maybe had been staying at the cottage. They just weren't quite sure what to think. So at that point, they decided that maybe they would stop into a local diner that they had noticed in the village earlier and ask some questions about the house they were renting and just Alfred Smith in general. After talking to the owner of the cafe, my grandparents decided that maybe it was time to move out of that summer cottage. My grandparents were told that Alfred Smith was murdered in that cottage in 1944. The owner of the cafe said that Alfred Smith had no known relatives in that area. When my grandparents asked about the lady that came to the cottage, they said they've heard about her, but no one knows anything about her. On the fifth day, my grandparents decided to take a walk. When they returned to the cottage, that same woman was sitting on the front doorstep. My grandparents started to walk up the long walkway to the house, and right at that moment, a bat flew into my grandmother's hair. My grandfather was trying to scare the bat away, and when they finally got the bat away from my grandmother's hair, they looked at the door, and the lady was gone. When they went inside the cottage, there was a fire going in the fireplace that they had not made. They went up to the bedroom, and the bedding was laying on the floor. As they were coming back down, they could hear bats again, but you couldn't see any bats flying in the cottage. On the sixth morning of staying in the cottage, my grandmother was making breakfast while my grandfather was out picking some fruit off a fruit tree. All of a sudden she heard, "Carolyn? David?" Carolyn and David were their grandchildren's names. So she thought her husband was playing a trick on her. She turned to look to see who was behind her. There was no one there. She looked out the window, and there was her husband picking fruit off the trees up on a ladder, so it couldn't have been him. My grandparents had decided this was enough for them, and they were going to move out the next morning. Again that night, exactly 3 a.m., the blankets flew off the bed. However, this night, they both looked, and a door opened to what they thought was probably Alfred Smith. They didn't wait for the morning. They left that night.